Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Well, first of all, welcome and thank you for coming tonight. Tonight is our sixth lecture, our annual lecture in Asian democracy on behalf of the University of Louisville Center for Asian Democracy and our co-sponsors, the World Affairs Council and Louisville Free Public Library. We're very pleased to welcome our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Economy, and she is the CV Starr Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council for Foreign Relations. Dr. Economy is an acclaimed author and expert on Chinese domestic and foreign policy. Her latest book, copies of which you can get at Carmichael's at the back, her latest book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, analyzes the contradictory nature of reform under President Xi Jinping. She's also the author of By All Means Necessary, How China's Resource Quest is Changing the World, published in 2014, and with Michael Levy, The River Runs Black, The Environmental Challenge to China's Future, published by Cornell University Press in 2004. Dr. Economy received her BA from Swarthmore College, her AM from Stanford University, and her PhD from the University of Michigan. And I'd like you to put your hands together and welcome Dr. Elizabeth Economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here. I had a chance to walk around the city today, and it's quite lovely, and an opportunity to meet with some students this afternoon, which was really a terrific experience. So thank you for hosting me for this really special visit. So I'm going to talk about China, and really there's never a dull time to talk about China. Something is always going on. This is probably an especially interesting time given what's going on in the U.S.-China relationship. I can say that in my 24, 25 years of working on this issue, I probably have never seen the relationship in the state that it's in today. So I'm happy to talk about the U.S.-China relationship as well, but I'm going to focus my remarks primarily on China and what's going on in China and the sort of transformative effect that I think Chinese President Xi Jinping has had on this country. So what I'd like to do is just start by taking you back, not too far back, just to October of 2017, when Xi Jinping was reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party. He served one term from 2012 to 2017, and now he was reselected in 2017 for a second 5-year term. At the party Congress, he delivered a roughly 3.5-hour speech. And somewhere in the middle of this speech, he uttered the phrase, "China has stood up, grown rich, become strong, and is moving towards center stage." And I think that phrase really encapsulates, in many respects, better than anything that I could have written, sort of the three big periods of contemporary Chinese history. So the first period China stood up was Mao Zedong standing up against the Japanese invaders as well as the ruling party at the time, the Kuomintang, and in 1949 creating the contemporary Chinese Communist Party state. The second period, some 30 years later, was ushered in by Deng Xiaoping. That was a period where Deng introduced the market into the Chinese economy, welcomed influences from outside, both economic and political. He believed that China should learn from the outside world. It was a time when civil society began to blossom. The first Chinese non-governmental organizations were established. And Deng also quite critically said he wanted to maintain a low-profile foreign policy. He wanted to focus on developing China at home and didn't want a lot of problems on the global stage. Fast forward again, almost 30 years to 2012, and now we have the third period. So Deng was the second period of growing rich, and actually he called his period China's second revolution. And I would say this is now the third revolution. Xi Jinping has ushered in a third revolution. And in many respects, I believe he has upended, right, Deng Xiaoping's the period, the 30 years of what we have come to know as reform and opening up. And so what I'd like to do is just sketch out for you the four sort of big trends that I see that have emerged over the past 6 years since Xi Jinping was first selected as General Secretary. So first, Xi Jinping has moved from Deng Xiaoping's sort of collective leadership, right? So you have a standing committee of the Politburo, the 7 to 9 men that govern China. He's moved from that 7 to 9 men governing China and sort of a collective sense of decision-making to one in which he himself is a far more authoritarian leader. He has amassed an enormous amount of institutional power into his own hands. When he came into power, he assumed control of most of the important committees and commissions that oversee broad areas of Chinese policy. So, for example, foreign policy, cybersecurity, domestic economic reform. Typically, these would be shared among the members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. But Xi Jinping really took control of all of the most important committees and commissions. He also launched an anti-corruption campaign. And that was really, I think, really the signal issue of his first 5 years. He started off almost immediately when he came to power saying that corruption, if not addressed, could mean the death of the Chinese Communist Party and the death of the Chinese state. You know, and anti-corruption campaigns have been a staple of Chinese political life for centuries, right? So they date, you know, back through the Ming, even earlier dynasties. And typically, if you look back, say, to Mao Zedong, he launched his first anti-corruption campaign in 1951. If you look back, you find that these anti-corruption campaigns, you know, they sort of build up for a year or two maybe, and then they die down, then they come back later, several years later, and you have another anti-corruption campaign. Because corruption is really endemic within Chinese society, and certainly within the Chinese Communist Party. But under Xi Jinping, the anti-corruption campaign has only grown more strong. So every year, more Chinese Communist Party officials have been arrested than the previous year or detained. So last year in 2017, over 500,000 Chinese officials, party officials, were detained. Right? So upwards of 1.3 million since he first took power. And so the interesting thing is that, you know, people will often ask, well, is the anti-corruption campaign real? And absolutely it's real, right? You know, Xi Jinping, from the time that he rose through the party ranks, it's the one issue that he talked about consistently, corruption. He said, you know, party officials should not use their official position for personal economic gain. So more than economic reform or anything else, this is really the issue that he focused on. So it's broad-based, and it's real, and it's important to the Chinese people, right? This is actually a very popular initiative, you know, at the grassroots level, because the Chinese people are confronted with all sorts of petty corruption on a daily basis. At the same time, Xi has used the anti-corruption campaign to target his political opponents and competitors. So there's a study that's done by a professor, which I don't think has been published yet. He was based at the University of Pennsylvania, and he looked at the level of vice minister and above, so sort of top levels of Chinese leadership, and found that of those officials, right, the ones who were arrested or detained, about 40% of them were in some way tied into or related to Xi Jinping's personal political enemies. So anti-corruption campaign is real, it's broad-based, but there's also a very personal political element to it for Xi Jinping. The other thing that Xi has done, and this got a lot of attention this past spring, was the party amended the Chinese constitution to eliminate the two-term limit for president. So Xi Jinping can serve as General Secretary for life, there's no limit. He can serve as Chairman of the Central Military Commission for life, again, no limit. But he could not serve as president for life. In 1992, one of the reforms was to amend the Constitution to put in this 2-term limit. And for many Chinese, especially sort of liberal intellectuals, and actually a lot of the party elders, the retired party elders, they looked upon this 2-term limit as a sign of the modern governance in the Chinese state. It meant that China was not some kind of banana republic in which a leader could simply rule for life. And so when Xi Jinping made this move successfully, there's a lot of opposition and a lot of unhappiness to this, but it passed. And so now he can hold the 3 most important positions for as long as he likes, or as long as the Communist Party and Xi Jinping together agree that he can. So the first thing is this, switch from this collective leadership to Xi Jinping amassing a lot of power. Let me make one small point, and we can talk about it more in the question and answer if you're interested, and that is that institutional power does not necessarily translate into sort of personal popularity or even political legitimacy. So even though he holds a lot of institutional power, there's also some what I would call significant pockets of discontent around Xi Jinping and the policies and the direction that he's moving the country. So the second shift that we've seen under Xi Jinping is a move to reassert the power of the Communist Party into Chinese society and into the Chinese economy. One of the hallmarks of the Deng era was really removing the Communist Party from the daily life of the people. Deng Xiaoping wanted, market to flourish. Again, civil society began to flourish under Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping has reversed this. Really moved to strengthen the role of the party. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how he's gone about doing that. First, as I'm sure many of you have read in the newspaper, there is a massive surveillance system being deployed in China today. Already there are about 176 million cameras in the country, and have AI do facial recognition. They want to get this up to more than 600 million cameras by 2020. They're pursuing voice recognition so that they can identify, 2 people who are talking to each other on the phone, know exactly who those 2 people are. If you really want to have a sense for the lengths to which the Chinese government is prepared to go in this direction, you can look at what's happening in Xinjiang, sort of Western Autonomous Region of China, where not only do they have cameras that basically can track people from the minute they leave their houses, but they've collected everybody's phones and, put on an app so that any app that they use, any search that they take, that information is sent to an off-site server where the Ministry of Local Public Security Bureau can look over what every individual is, doing on his or her phone. They are taking DNA samples. They collected everybody's passports. By one estimate, 10% of the sort of Uyghur Muslims population, adult population, in Xinjiang has now been sent to a re-education camp. So this is really a wholesale effort to eliminate the culture, the religion, the language of the Uyghur people. The repression, the level of repression, I think, is greater than almost any place in the world today. Now, to be fair, the Xinjiang has been the site of very significant violence. Members of the Uyghur population have joined ISIS. There is a secessionist movement. So the Chinese leadership is not simply doing this for no reason, but certainly I think the approach that they've taken and the degree to which they have moved to repress this local population is really far exceeds the threat that any of those elements pose. So that's one way in which the party is beginning to reassert itself. A second, and again something that's made its way into the popular press, is the advent of a social credit system. And this is really simply a means of determining a person's trustworthiness. Right now, there's no national program. There are many different pilot programs, and individual regions are doing things differently. And even in 2020, when the program is supposed to be national, it's still mostly going to be linked in from different parts of the country. It's not going to have, not every place is going to have the same set of metrics that they're looking at, but it includes things like, have you participated in a protest, right? Have you defaulted on your loans? Have you jaywalked? Many different measures. It also will evaluate your friends. So if your friends do things that are bad, that will affect your social credit negatively. So it's a good way of exerting, your social pressure on your friends to do the right thing. What will they use the social credit score for? Well, it can determine whether or not you can get on a plane. So already there are about 10 million people in China who can't board a plane because they've defaulted on their loans. Can you get your child into the best school? Can you jump a line at a restaurant? Or many, many different things. So each part of the country has a different set of metrics. It's going to be done through AI. It's going to be done through potentially local neighborhood committees spying on people to see whether they jaywalk or do bad things and reporting in on them. But this is, a very different sort of Communist Party approach to societal governance than we had during the Deng era. Much more intrusive, much more reminiscent of the Maoist era. Now, it's interesting, when I was doing the research for the book, I went to something kind of akin to a WeWork. It's called 3Q, and it's they're beautiful buildings where young Chinese, mostly in their 20s, 30s, are doing startups, tech startups for the most part. So when I was getting a tour of one, I just informally asked about 15 people what they thought of the social credit system. And most of them, the vast majority of them, thought that it was a good thing. And it was because they said there is not much trust within Chinese society outside of the family. And it's just a good reminder to me, and I think for everybody, that different political cultures, may look upon things quite differently. And so what might appear to be extremely intrusive here in the United States may not be viewed in the same light in China. That's not to say that, people in China would agree to live under the conditions that people in Xinjiang are living. I don't think they would. But some elements of this social credit system seem to be quite appealing to at least some parts of the Chinese population. In terms of the economy, it's also been quite striking to see how Xi has pushed the party. So party committees, he's energized party committees in Chinese enterprises and Chinese companies, but not only state-owned enterprises, but also in private enterprises and in joint ventures. And so, party committees are just made up of the party members who work in a particular company. And so there are 89 million, roughly 89, 90 million members of the Communist Party in China. So, every company has members of the Communist Party. How active these party committees were really depends on who's heading it, whether they take it seriously. Many times they're kind of just a big joke. But the basic point was, Xi Jinping gives a speech and the party committee might meet to discuss it, or they'll get guidance about some tree planting campaign that they ought to be undertaking, or whatever it is. It's just, you're listening to what's coming down and you are sort of the implementing force within your company. But Xi Jinping has moved to have these party committees actually take actions, investment actions, right, to try to influence the economic decisions of these firms. So I was talking, for example, with the head of Chinese part of a multinational, a big German chemical company. And he told me that the party committee had come to him and said that they wanted this company to invest in a certain location. And it made no sense for the company to do that, but party wanted them to do it because they wanted to develop this part of the country. And this company pushed back, and they ended up not having to do it. But this is something that affects not only the multinationals, but also the private entrepreneurs in China. So you can take a company like Alibaba, right? One of China's biggest, most powerful companies. And Alibaba was forced to take a stake in China Unicom, right? A big state-owned telecommunications company. More recently, they were pushed to take a stake, or are being pushed to take a stake in a cell tower, a failing SOE cell tower company. These private entrepreneurs don't want to do that either. They don't want, they're market-driven entrepreneurs. They don't want to be told by the Chinese Communist Party that they need to take stakes in money-losing state-owned enterprises. So this is a source of some concern, as you might imagine, for both private enterprises and joint ventures in China. But again, really something quite different from what was occurring during the Deng era. The third significant shift under Xi Jinping is what I call the creation of a virtual wall of restrictions and regulations that allow Xi to control more closely, more carefully, what comes into the country. So again, as I mentioned, Deng Xiaoping welcomed outside influences, both in terms of ideas, also people, human and financial capital to come in from the outside. Xi Jinping is much more wary of outside ideas. And even in some cases, foreign capital. One of the first things that we started hearing by January, February, after he took power in November of 2012, was that Chinese universities, professors were being forced to tell the heads of the universities about any books that they were using, any foreign books, right? And they would have to get approval to use any foreign book in their classrooms. Cameras started being put in, classrooms of some teachers to make sure that they weren't saying anything that was sort of, in opposition to what the Communist Party was articulating. So a whole different sense, within the university structure of how open to be to the outside world. But then we began to see much more significant, in some respects, moves. So, for example, in 2017, they enforced what was called a law on the management of foreign NGOs. So prior to this point, there were about 7,000 foreign NGOs in China. And these NGOs were, non-governmental organizations, right? They were active in things like environmental protection, poverty alleviation, health concerns. In the environment, I can tell you that for a big period in the 90s and the 2000s, that international NGOs and foundations were responsible for funding about 90% of Chinese environmental NGOs. Right, so an enormous impact. It would bring Chinese environmental activists to the United States, put them in U.S. environmental NGOs to get trained. Very strong linkages developed, and this was true in many other areas as well. So, and not just the United States, but European, Canadian, et cetera. So about upwards of 7,000 of them before this point. When the law came into force, what happened was that the NGOs had to re-register. They moved from the Ministry of Civil Society to the Ministry of Public Security. So already you can see the difference in the mindset, right? The Ministry of Public Security signals, both to the foreign NGOs and to the Chinese, that there's a potential perceived security threat from these foreign NGOs. And the NGOs had to find government sponsors, which was also the case beforehand. You're supposed to have a government sponsor. But now the government bureaucracies, agencies were much more wary of taking on responsibility for these foreign NGOs because they were no longer in favor with the government, right? The government didn't really want them there. So now, today, there are about 400 foreign NGOs that are formally able to operate in China. So it's really significant. And what's the significance of that? I think twofold. First, that simply, again, the foreign NGOs were a real source of civil society capacity building in China, right? We've had NGOs for a lot longer, and we train and help them develop. But also, that civil society, that people-to-people interaction was one of the foundational pillars of the U.S.-China relationship. And if we're looking to understand, what's going on in the U.S.-China relationship today, and why it's so fraught, one of the groups that would typically stand up and push for a better relationship would be that NGO sector. But now it's much weaker and much smaller, right? So in many respects, this NGO law has, undermined one of the foundational pillars of the entire relationship. In terms of the economy, Xi Jinping has also demonstrated a propensity to try to control competition from multinationals. I'm sure many of you have heard of the program Made in China 2025. This is one of the things that President Trump's tariffs are supposed to target. So Made in China 2025 is basically says that by 2025, the government wants Chinese companies to command, generally speaking, about 80% of the domestic market in 10 critical cutting-edge areas of technology. Right? This includes things like AI, new materials, information, next-generation information technology, new energy vehicles, medical devices. So this is something President Trump is saying. Obviously, you're really constraining foreign competition. You're constraining the opportunity for American companies to compete, and we're already seeing the impact. So in Sichuan province, for example, the local government has told all the hospitals in the province for 15 different medical devices, like stents, respirators, whatever, you must buy Chinese products. No more products from multinationals, no matter whether they're more expensive, no matter whether they're inferior, right? It's an effort to give these Chinese companies time, right, to capture the market and then develop, and then be able to compete globally, right, with the multinationals. But they need time to do that, to incubate. So this is a major program of great significance, right? So I think President Trump actually is right to target it. The method perhaps is not the right way, but I think it is significant. And then finally, I would just point to the internet. The internet has become far more constrained under Xi Jinping than previously, both the flow of information within the country, but also the ability of Chinese to access information outside of the country. One of the things just this past spring, one of the new regulations was that all of the VPNs, the virtual private networks, right, are now supposed to be controlled by the Chinese government. This is yet to be fully enforced, so we'll have to see what happens with it, but it just gives you a sense of the general direction in which the government is moving. And then finally, maybe the sort of change, the transformation in Chinese policy that's most evident to people outside the country is the shift from Deng Xiaoping's low-profile foreign policy to a far more ambitious and expansive foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And I'll just point to 3 areas where I think this is particularly important. The first is in terms of Xi's moves to not only stake claims around Chinese sovereignty, but to realize them. So that includes the South China Sea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. These are the areas that mainland China considers to be its sovereign territory. Under Deng Xiaoping basically said, yes, we have all these disputes with our neighbors, but we will put them off to another time when, we are better able to settle them. Future generations will be able to do a better job of resolving them than we will right now. Xi Jinping has decided that the future is now, right? And so he is moving quite aggressively to, first, as we've seen in the South China Sea, right, which is a territory that is claimed by a number of other nations, including Vietnam and the Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan. There's another one too. But in any case, a number of small Southeast Asian nations. He has sort of built up 7 artificial features and militarized them. This even after he promised President Obama, standing in the Rose Garden, the White House, that he would not militarize them, but he has. With regard to Taiwan, there's a mix of highly coercive policies, but also inducements to try to bind Taiwan more closely to the mainland. For example, we've seen just in the past several months that China has been very active in its dollar diplomacy. Very few nations actually grant Taiwan diplomatic recognition, and we've seen just in the past few months a couple of different countries switch their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to mainland China, because China is basically paying them to do so. You may also remember recently that American airline companies like United came under enormous pressure by the Chinese government to change their website so that it didn't acknowledge Taiwan as a separate entity, as an entity separate from the mainland, and said basically, if you don't do this, you're not going to be doing business in China. So a number of coercive policies really designed to shrink Taiwan's international space. They also have dropped the number of tourists that are going to Taiwan. This is a very traditional sort of tool of Chinese economic coercion. They also did this when they were upset with South Korea over the deployment of the THAAD a couple of years ago, right? All of a sudden, Chinese tourists basically stopped going to South Korea. And for a number of China's neighboring countries, Chinese tourism is now an enormous source of income, of revenue. So it hurts. It hurts. So there are these kinds of coercive policies, but also inducements, right? Telling Taiwanese businessmen, relocate your businesses here in the mainland and we will give you national treatment. Right? We will treat your companies, we'll give your companies every benefit and advantage that we give Chinese companies. Right? You will not be treated as multinationals. So a complex set of inducements and coercive measures, but ultimately Xi Jinping has set 2049 as a kind of soft target date for the reunification. So that's one big change that we've seen under Xi Jinping. A second would be the development, the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Beginning in 2013 and then 2014, Xi articulated his vision, to recreate the Silk Road and the maritime spice routes in a sort of modern, contemporary form through infrastructure development, linking China through to the rest of Asia, Middle East, Europe, and Africa, through ports and railroads, highways. Then there was another iteration. This is an idea that has morphed and evolved. It's quite opportunistic, and today looks very little like what it was originally. So the next iteration was a digital Belt and Road. So China would help countries develop the satellite systems and the e-commerce and the fiber optic cables. It's another way to link China to all of these countries. And then there was a polar ice belt. China was going to go, through the Arctic to link China, faster to Europe. There's a security component, right? The ports. China now controls about 76 ports in 35 countries. And originally, China says, they're just for commercial purposes. But we've seen already that in a number of instances, PLA Navy ships have made port visits. Of course, China also established its first military logistics base in Djibouti in Africa. And this is surprising only because, historically, China has said it would never develop bases. It would never put in place bases outside its country. And that's why this matters, because you can argue, certainly China has the second largest army in the world. It's the second largest economy. Why shouldn't it, right, do what it's doing? But it really does run counter to everything that it has said, for the past 60-odd years. And there's also a political component, I would argue. And this is a source of some debate, I would say, in the China field about whether China is trying to export its political model. And I would say it's not trying to export its political model in its entirety. It's not trying to develop communist parties globally. But it is helping other countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, developing countries, to manage their populations, to help them with social stability. What does this mean? It means that they are trying to export their surveillance system to Pakistan. It means that they are training African officials on ideas around internet sovereignty, right? Controlling the internet, controlling media, openness, and freedom. So it's not that the entirety of the political model is being exported, but certain elements of it are. And this is important also for the final point that I'm going to make, which is that China also wants to change the rules of the game. There's a great quotation from a speech that Xi Jinping gave back in 2014, where he said that China should contribute not only to help write the rules of the game, but also to construct the playgrounds on which the games are played. And what he means by that is that he really wants to reshape international institutions and norms of global governance in ways that reflect Chinese interests and values and priorities. And again, it's not surprising, given China's size and the role that it wants to play on the global stage. But it is something that we need to be aware of. So in practical terms, China is very active now in the Human Rights Council, trying to change the language around human rights. In negotiations over, on global internet governance negotiations, right? China is, pushing its ideas of not the free flow of information, which is, of course, what the United States advocates, but internet sovereignty. Every country should be able to determine what comes in and what goes out of, its physical boundaries, through the internet. It's managed to get its Belt and Road Initiative, into the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So now it's linked in all of the documents, the UN documents, the Belt and Road Initiative. This despite the fact that many countries now are pushing back against the Belt and Road because the projects are not environmentally sustainable, because they know they're never going to be able to pay them back. I mean, the IMF has identified 8 countries that are Belt and Road project recipients where the levels of debt are so great that they're saying these countries will never pay them back. And you see what happened in Sri Lanka, where they couldn't pay back the debt, and China simply took control of a port. So more and more countries are becoming concerned about these Belt and Road projects and the sort of longer-term negative implications. Nonetheless, if China is out there training officials in many countries, in ways that support sort of Chinese political values and norms, then those countries then become allies in international negotiations as well. Right? And so slowly but surely, I think you can see that the institutions that have supported the liberal international order, that China seeks to erode them. So I don't want to be too dramatic, but I do think it's important at least that we keep our eyes open to sort of the slow progress that I think China is making in many of these areas. So I'm going to stop here just by saying, if there's a tagline to all of this, I would just say that Xi Jinping has created a China that is more repressive and authoritarian at home, but more ambitious and expansive abroad. So I'm going to stop there, and I guess Dr. Abbott, you're going to come and have a little...
So what we're going to do for the question and answer session, I'm going to start by asking Dr. Economy a couple of questions, and then while we're doing that, if you have a question for her, can you line up behind the standing mic that we have between the 2 sets of chairs, and we'll have about 20 minutes for questions which I'll take from those of you who have something they want to say. So I think fascinating talk. I guess what's probably on the minds of a lot of people in the audience tonight is the news that was announced today. First, that the United States is going to impose $200 billion worth of new tariffs on the Chinese, and then the Chinese have announced that they will retaliate next Monday by imposing $60 billion back. Why has all common sense been lost in trade talks? What's going on? What's going on, Liz? Tell us.
So, look, I think there's broad consensus in Washington across the political spectrum, right? Democrats, Republicans alike, I would say, within the think tank community as well, that China is simply too big at this point. Its economy is too big to continue behaving the way that it's been behaving. So if you're looking at things like intellectual property theft or, market access, barriers to market access for, foreign companies, or the subsidies that the Chinese government provides to, its state-owned enterprises, many things that we consider to be sort of unfair advantages that China has, that we've tolerated for a long time because China was still developing, and we believed that if we would model best behavior, that China eventually was going to start to look more like us and behave more like us. I think it's another way in which the Xi Jinping era, right, has upended that. And China's economy is simply too big, right? U.S. can't afford to allow China to continue with these practices. All right, I think that's at the heart of all of this. President Trump, of course, has a very particular view, not shared by pretty much any economist, that the bilateral trade deficit, right, is the most significant feature of all of this. And that's, if you look at President Trump's China policy, it really focused on 2 things: North Korea and the bilateral trade deficit. The issues that I just raised about the market access, IP theft, et cetera, kind of came in later from people who are more deeply rooted in these issues. So now they're all part of what these tariffs are supposed to address. President Trump has a belief that through these tariffs, he can bring the Chinese economy to its knees and get the Chinese to fold. In fact, as I this is being recorded, as I just heard the other day from somebody in Washington who briefs the president, he believes that the tariffs have already had a significant impact on China by basically bringing Made in China 2025 to a screeching halt. He is, of course, wrong on this, but I think he has in his mind that the tariffs are working and that the Chinese at some point are going to fold. The Chinese, what the Chinese are saying is quite different. So if you look at the objective economic impact of the tariffs in China, it's had an impact. There's no two ways about it, right? Stock market at the lowest point since 2014. Every month for the past 5 months, exports have fallen. In August, more Chinese firms laid off workers than hired workers. So you see the impact that it's having. The Chinese leadership, however, is the narrative that they're delivering is, we've got this, right? Everything's under control. And the impact on the Chinese economy at most, 0.5 percentage point on the GDP, right? So they're saying, we're not worried. The Chinese companies, I think, and I haven't spoken to Chinese companies, so this is only from what I've read, but the message that they're also delivering is a fairly confident one, by and large. It can be, we produce something that's so specialized that Americans have nowhere else to go for it, and we will simply pass the cost along to the consumer. Or we're looking and we're finding other markets, right, for our products. Now, I'm sure that there are companies that are very concerned, but I can say there's not a lot of agitation right now. The agitation seems to be limited to economists in China. And there's actually a fair amount of agitation. So one of the impacts that it has had is they've had to slow down, basically bring to a halt the effort, the deleveraging effort, right? So one of Xi Jinping's major priorities that he announced in March was to reduce the amount of debt in the Chinese economy, corporate debt as well as local government debt. And so they've been making some progress on that. Now with the pressure from the trade war, that's basically stopped. Right? And the Chinese economists are engaged in a brutal battle over who's to blame. We know is the Ministry of Finance or the central bank and blah, anyway. So that's going on. And it's become a point for the reform-oriented economists to say, if this doesn't show us anything else, it shows us the time is now to reform, right? We should be doing basically what the United States is saying in terms of fundamental structural reform of our economy. So near as I can tell, that's the range of impacts that it seems to be having in China. It is not having any impact on intellectual property theft, not having any impact on Made in China 2025, on market access barriers, and in fact, U.S. companies are saying that the Chinese are doing that kind of informal stuff that they do to make it difficult for American companies, even though they say they're not, which is taking a long time to approve a license, right? Maybe doing some inspections of a factory that slows down production, things that just annoy companies and make their lives generally more difficult. So, why has everybody lost, all common sense? I mean, I think that's the answer to that is outside, China expert. I think everybody here can come to their own conclusion on that.
Of course. And the second question I have really concerns the broader Chinese society. So you've outlined the ways in which Xi Jinping has increased the repression of Chinese society significantly since he became president. But I wonder if you could speak to the vibrancy of societal life in China. And we don't hear much about, for example, the fact that things like protests against illegal land seizures are massive and take place widespread across the country. So how vibrant is Chinese social life despite the best efforts of the Communist Party to control all forms of, collective protest?
Right. So I thought you were going to take it in a slightly different direction, which is that the vibrancy in Chinese social life around things like in the tech sector, which is very vibrant and very exciting, and China's the world of innovation in China is is a really great space to be in, and very much like our Silicon Valley. I mean, money is pouring in there, lots of young people, very enthusiastic, working on these kinds of issues, and we can talk more about that. It's something I spent a little time interviewing some people in that sector, but you went in the other direction. So in terms of social protest and social discontent. So the Chinese government used to release statistics on the number of protests, and the last one that we had that was produced by actually a professor at Tsinghua was 180,000 protests in a year, right? And he put that number out in 2012. We don't have any whole country statistics that I've seen since then, but certainly there have been protests. What kind of protests? So protests of, retired PLA officers who aren't getting their pensions. Environmental protests certainly are still occurring. Land seizures, yes, that's a staple of Chinese political life. Also, protests by workers who are being displaced by the gig economy. I think one of the things, we've started to talk in this country, of course, about what will be the implications of, AI and robotics and all of this for labor, right, for employment. And, some concerns, and what do we do about job retraining, et cetera. China, as near as I can tell, has yet to engage that in a truly, in a deep way, that same question. And in many respects, they are going to be much more profoundly affected by that transition than we are, because we are a much wealthier overall society than they are. And so what will happen to the masses of factory workers? They had an example recently in the paper of a Chinese factory that employed a couple of hundred workers, and now is down to 10, right? With a single guy sitting there in this huge floor, right? With machines. All he does all day is by himself stand there and, periodically check to make sure these machines are working. So we've seen protests by people who are being laid off or who are being squeezed, right, by technology. And so I think that's something that's going to be increasing, and that the Chinese government has not yet addressed and is actually fairly ill-equipped to address moving forward. So there are protests around many different issues. I think there are those individual protests, there are the broad sort of sweeping movements. For example, the Feminist Movement, right, which is quite strong in China. And it's a movement that has strong linkages to the international community. It's a movement that engages university students quite actively. There have been some linkages between the feminist movement and workers. So it's quite interesting. The thing that the Chinese government fears most are two things. Number one, when you have different groups of discontented people linking up, right? So one of the things we just saw were university students working with factory workers to establish an independent trade union. That was very quickly squashed, as you might imagine. So they don't like when people link up, and they don't like when protests cross provincial boundaries, right? So to the extent that, especially this started to happen, once the internet became, part of Chinese political life, you began to have protests, environmental protests in particular, that crossed provincial boundaries. So that's the other thing that they fear the most. So there's still very active protests, but we don't have any numbers to tell us exactly how significant it is. But we know it's significant.
Yes, I'll take questions from the floor now, please.
Excellent. Thank you again for coming, and welcome to Louisville. My question is about the role of rule of law under Xi Jinping and how you feel that's evolved. You commented on a couple of things that are related to that, but specifically, how do you see that, and what, if anything, changes to that could influence foreign investment in China?
Okay. So Xi Jinping started off talking a lot about the rule of law. One of the plenums, the meetings that happen, annual plenums that happen in between the major party congresses, focused on the rule of law. I think what we've seen is that the sort of important thing that people in the West were looking for, which was really the separation of the party, an independent judicial system, has not happened. And in fact, the party has even more sort of come on top of not just the legal system, but many parts of the Chinese government. And so while there's a lot of talk about the rule of law. I think the rule by law still holds, and the party determines, right, what's going to happen. There is no, there is no opportunity for those Uyghurs, right, to get, some kind of due process. So I think the initial hopes and expectations of many Western legal experts that Xi Jinping was going to usher in a sort of new period of rule of law have completely not materialized. I will say that many companies, if they look back 5 or 10 years, will say that China's making a better effort to protect intellectual property, that there has been some improvement on that front, not enough, but they have demonstrated that they're moving in the right direction. Still are the rulings enforced? Are the fines big enough? No, but generally speaking, that's one area. They've developed a series of specialized courts to do that, and I think that's one area where you might look for a little bit of progress.
And the next lady, please.
First of all, thank you very much for your detailed and excellent information. It's been eye-opening. My question is short-term and long-term. Where do the interests of the Soviet Union and China come together or collide?
So you're after my own heart because you call that the Soviet Union. And I started my life as a Soviet expert, so I sometimes still do that too. But Russia, okay, Soviet Union to Russia. So China and Russia, so people become very concerned about a closer relationship between China and Russia. In particular, there are people in the foreign policy community in the United States that say that President Trump, by his actions, are pushing them together. This kind of thing. I mean, the truth is that China and Russia have often and long acted together, for example, in the United Nations, right? They often vote together. China abstained when it came to the, Russian invasion of Crimea. The Russians don't complain about Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. They partner this way all the time. Having said that, they are enhancing their relationship. They had the largest joint military exercises ever this year. I would say President Putin has, to some extent, accepted a role as a junior partner when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. He had his own, what was it called? Economic Union, I can't remember, it was the EEU. Anyway, he had his own idea for linking Russia in through Central Asia, which he basically then said, which was competitive with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and then he basically said, okay, we'll feed into the Belt and Road Initiative, so he kind of took a junior status. Meanwhile, China is perfectly content to allow Russia sort of to play the big power in the Middle East. China's happy to do business in the Middle East. It doesn't want to be mucking around, militarily in Syria, for example. So there's a kind of division of labor that emerges between the two of them. Now, is there any light between the two? I think there is some. I think there are people in in Russia who resent the fact that China is now, the second, largest economy and military, and is considered much closer, on par with the United States than Russia is. Obviously, the Russian economy doesn't look anything like the Chinese economy today. So I think there are some divisions. There was an article that was quite critical of China recently in a major Russian newspaper that got a lot of attention. But generally, the Chinese just awarded Putin their, big Medal of Honor thing, our best friend in the world. So they are trying and largely do work together, pretty much across the board. So that's right now. I'd say long term, it's possible that their interests will diverge. I think if China, how Chinese interests somehow run up against Russian interests in the Russian Far East, or if Russia begins to feel China's becoming too much of a colonial power in Central Asia, for example, I think then you could begin to see a little bit more conflict. But in many respects, they share a lot of the same values when it comes to things like the internet and human rights, et cetera. So they find themselves working together a lot.
The next question, please.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very eye-opening and very interesting. So before I ask my question, just to preface where this question is coming from, I am a high schooler, which means that I didn't really get to live the history, a lot of the history and context that's being talked about here. And I'm also a libertarian socialist. So I consider the take that China and the United States have taken to be rather disconcerting. But my question regards your perception of Chinese authoritarianism under Deng Xiaoping versus Xi Jinping. Because from what I have read regarding Chinese social policy under Deng Xiaoping, things were not really much more different, and I think that's really encapsulated by the Tiananmen Square crackdowns that took place against liberal democratic student protesters and libertarian socialist student protesters. And so, just in short, what do you see as truly different, civil rights-wise, now under Xi Jinping versus Deng Xiaoping?
Okay, so I think Tiananmen Square, the demonstrations by the students and the crackdown, the massacre, was a particular type of event in China, right? So it was something that the Chinese government came to believe threatened the very existence of the government, right? The very stability of the state and the future of the Communist Party, right? It rose to a level that they had not experienced, and they certainly haven't experienced since then. So yes, you're quite right. It was a massive crackdown. It was brutal, and in the aftermath, there was much greater political repression. But more broadly within civil society, right? And for example, what you could write, what you could say on the internet, right? As you moved through the Deng era, through up till 2010, 2011, you had, the internet was basically a virtual political space. Freedom of expression reigned. You had billionaire bloggers talking about the need for political reform. You had an environmental movement that was both physical in its manifestation through protests, but also really brought enormous pressure to bear on the government via the internet. You had groups of people who, if they believed that somebody was unjustly accused of a crime, right, you had kind of investigative journalists, right, operating in the internet who would try to figure out what had really happened and then have mass internet protest to get the, accused person, the wrongly accused person released from jail. All of these things were taking place prior to 2012. Now, the billionaire bloggers who had 10, 20, 50 million followers talking about political reform and all this stuff, totally cut off at the knees, right? Paraded on TV, criticized, all these things. They don't say anything anymore. So I think while you're right that there was this one particular event that happened, a lot of what Xi Jinping is doing now is to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. But in the broader context, in the broader political space, it is radically different today from the way that it was pre-Xi Jinping.
Thank you.
Just a theory.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, don't go anywhere. I'm sorry, we are out of time. Thank you. Before, I know, but we have a reception that we have to get to. Before I ask Xiaoyin to just make a few final announcements and let everybody go, it's customary at our annual lecture to present our speaker with a gift. And we all know that Kentucky and Louisville are famous for bourbon, but it's not really appropriate as a representative of the University of Louisville to give alcohol away freely. So the other thing that obviously that we're known for is our baseball bats. We are the home of the oldest baseball bat factory in the country. And so we have an engraved baseball bat for you which says Asian Democracy Lecture 2018, Dr. Elizabeth Economy. So please join me in thanking our speaker tonight. There you go. We'll post it to you. And Zhao Yun, we'd just like to make a few announcements on behalf of the World Affairs Council before you leave. And Dr. Economy will be available to sign copies of her latest book at the back on your way out.
This has been a Metro TV production.